Hi there, welcome to Active Intelligence. I'm Aaron Ironside. I hope you'll spend the next half an hour with me as we take a look at social issues that are affecting ordinary Kiwis and find out what the other side of the story is. Some balance rather than some bias. And with Christopher Luxon, the new leader of the National Party, there couldn't be a more perfect week than to talk about faith and politics on Active Intelligence. On today's episode, I catch up with Alfred Nado, former National MP, former pastor, to talk about his faith in politics. But of course, this week all eyes were on the National Party as they appointed Christopher Luxon to be the new leader. And it would seem that the journalists only knew two things about Luxon, that he was the former boss of Air New Zealand and an evangelical Christian.
A self-described evangelical Christian, Christopher Luxon has conservative views against abortion and euthanasia.
My faith is personal to me. It is not in itself a political agenda.
Not hiding his political ambitions or the influence of his evangelical Christian faith on his life.
My faith is a very personal thing. It gives me centre, sort of mission, it gives me mission and purpose.
That faith filtering through. Christopher Luxon is socially conservative. After his botany seat nomination in 2019, News Hub asked his stance on legalising cannabis.
I'm against that.
End-of-life choice.
I'm against the reforms.
And abortion.
Those are issues where I personally am not up for the reform.
Christopher Luxon has some clear talking points about faith, doesn't he? It's pretty obvious that he's been briefed on what to say. His mantra, which he used in his maiden speech and in pretty much every press appearance ever since, is that his faith is personal. The idea being, of course, is that people shouldn't be afraid that he's going to be suddenly asking God how to vote and using his faith to guide him in the political arena, that he has a personal friendship with God, I suppose, is the idea, and that it's part of his personal life. Which is true, it's just not part of his private life. Just like your marriage is personal, but it's not private. You have a public celebration of your love, a wedding for everybody to see that you'll be married. And for people of faith, of course, particularly in the Christian tradition, they have things like baptism, where you have to be willing essentially to say to a group of strangers, to the world, I've decided to follow Jesus. So yes, your faith is personal, but it's not private, and that's going to be a challenge for Christopher Luxon as he takes this personal faith into a very public space where the things of faith are naturally present simply because wherever humans are, whatever they believe is present. Because he's got his talking points, of course, we don't know that much about his faith, so perhaps he'd be more willing to open up when talking to the Christian media.
Yeah, I guess, because I've come from a world of business beforehand, I was in New Zealand and then Unilever overseas before that. It's never really been, it's always been I've been a CEO first and a Christian who just happens to be a CEO. When I came to political life, what I found was, some people wanted to define what that was going to be about, what my faith was about. And so for me, I just felt, look, my first chance to speak, I was actually the last new MP to speak. You get 15 minutes to say whatever you really want, sort of why you're there, what you hope to achieve, what you're about. And I thought, no, my faith is really central to me and I need to define it on my terms. So, for me, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, we want to see Christians in public life, and we're not extreme because we choose to do so. For me, it's just sort of anchored me. It's given me a lot of purpose, and it's shaped my values. And I think it's really important that you're part of something that's bigger than yourself. And I think that's where my faith comes in. And so, for me, I think sometimes Christians have been separatist, judgmental, and then I think really when you look at Jesus in the Bible, he talks about compassion, and he's a great example, tolerance, care for others, doesn't judge, doesn't discriminate or reject people, and so that's the sort of example I think I'm trying to follow and imperfectly as I do each and every day. So right. But it's a great thing. I think it's important that we actually have Christians going into all parts of the world, and equally going as a Christian into politics. I think it's really important that you do have a separation between faith or religion and state in particular. And I think the Americans sort of understand that in their political system because they've had presidents of faith in their past. But the idea is that I'm there to represent all New Zealanders and not just one religion or one group or one interest. And I think that's really important as well. That I'm not there to force my beliefs on others. And as a result, you shouldn't vote for someone because of their faith, and you shouldn't reject someone because of their faith either. We need a really different set of worldviews in that place.
Well, it's slightly more open, and I appreciate that he's trying to be very careful, because in the political environment in which we live, we know that to be a Christian is not a popular thing. It's not like the US, where if you're a presidential candidate, you have to at least feign some kind of faith, because it's an absolute given that whoever occupies the White House will be some kind of believer. The opposite is true in New Zealand, and so consequently he's being very cautious. Of course, it's not as if he's the only Christian in Parliament, or indeed the only Christian in the National Party. Let's go across the aisle to David Clark from the Labour Party, a former Presbyterian minister, to compare and contrast their views of their faith and the person of Jesus.
I've grown up in the Presbyterian church. My mother was a Presbyterian elder, so I've always had a connection with the church, and I trained for the Presbyterian ministry. Strong sense that was the thing that I needed to do, and the service I needed to provide in my life as a younger man, and then I've had a sense that of in religious terms you'd call calling towards politics after that.
Right.
But my upbringing as a Christian and in terms of the education that I was fortunate to receive as part of my training has influenced the way I think about the world. I look to the example of Jesus in the Bible and the things that he did and the life that he lived, and that's important to me as I think about how I go about politics and the things that I do. It's not something this is probably one of very few interviews where I canvass this. It's not something that I wear on my shoulder, I guess, on my sleeve. Of course it influences. All of us are influenced by those things we hold dear.
When you look at that Jesus character in the Bible, who's your Jesus?
Yeah, well, the Jesus I see in the Bible is one who's eating with outcasts, who's hanging out with the vulnerable, healing the sick and the weak, who says, "Blessed are the poor." Somebody with compassion, who goes out and serves others. And I think when you kind of read the Bible, the New Testament, it's hard not to see those things. A lot. I guess if you're asking me to compare to that person who's building walls and all of those things, I don't think you'll see Jesus if you actually read the Bible. You won't see Jesus doing those things. It's there is a lot of stuff that's around the church that doesn't actually reflect what's in the Bible, in my view.
David Clark there from the Labour Party, reminding us, of course, that faith is not the domain of conservatives, but it is fascinating, of course, that depending on which side of the political spectrum you find yourself, which parts of the Bible and the Christian message will appeal most. It seems, in broad, sweeping terms, that conservatives favour the more moral aspects of the Bible, so they tend to be more concerned with issues like abortion, for example, and euthanasia, where the more left-leaning Christians tend to favour those social justice parts of the Bible, caring for the poor, making sure that people who can't look after themselves get looked after. Of course, immediately you realise that it's not as if there aren't plenty of people on either side of that political spectrum who would say, yeah, hold on, I agree with what you just said. It's an uncomfortable alliance for Christians to find a political party to belong to, because no one party reflects all of the things that are important to Christians, which is, of course, why so often we've seen these failed attempts at Christian political parties. Today, I catch up with Alfred Nado. He's a former national MP, 9 years. He's got a good experience there, and a pastor and Christian worker, has a theological degree. And I asked him about whether or not faith was part of his story from the beginning.
Yeah, being Polynesian, being Pacific, my parents came from the Cook Islands, and we call it the 3 F's, faith. So we always learned what it meant to get up in the morning, say our prayers, read our Bible, go to church. And so faith has always been a key part of who we are. The second F is family. So everything involves around the social construct of what it means to be, I suppose, Pacific and Polynesian has always been about family. And then the last F is the future. So our parents always sort of would say to us, don't forget, get a good education, get a good job, do well. Your success is our success. So so the future was always something that was impressed upon us.
Well, of course, you weren't just any kind of Christian. You're a professional Christian. Tell me about that part of your life.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting statement, Aaron. Is that one of your psychological moments? You try and mess with my head and make me think differently. So, yeah, I mean, being a professional Christian, I suppose what you're saying to me is that, when I stepped into the realm of being a politician and then being in politics and then holding my faith, being something that I wasn't afraid of and not ashamed of. In fact, it's something that I was quite happy to talk about how faith affected my politics, my values and my views. And so to me, that was always really important. I went from being a pastor to being a politician. My kids were PKs, they said, Dad, you realize we were not only pastors' kids, but we're politicians' kids, And I hadn't thought about that. And I said, yeah, well, that's right. And so, so the whole thing about, I suppose, putting your faith in the public square has always been something that I hadn't thought about, but became very natural. And like you said, that it's, as I was saying, it's something that we grew up with. So we were never ashamed of it. And I suppose at an early age, we learned how to actually express it in different ways.
It's interesting, this kind of transition between pastor and politician. There's a famous quote where Billy Graham was asked if he'd like to be the president of the United States, and he said, no, the office is too low compared to being a preacher of the gospel. A lot of Christians would feel like that way, that being a pastor, particularly in a Pacific Island context, is a position of great respect, of mana, authority, and somehow being a politician maybe not perceived to be that much of a promotion, perhaps a step down even. So talk to me about the sense that, we can be called by our faith into work that expresses the faith, like being a pastor, but also into domains where the faith won't be front and center the whole time.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is that there's a survey that's done every year called the Trust and Confidence Survey, and it asks people about different sort of their views on different occupations, right? And so Aaron, do you know what the most trusted profession is?
I'm going to hope that something like an airline pilot, because I always trust them.
No, not quite. Actually, it's a fireman. It's your frontline essential workers, like it's a fireman. It's a paramedic. Those are the. And so now the flip side of it. So, what do you think is the least trusted profession?
I'm going to have to say that people who sell insurance or cars are probably going to get a tough role here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, what has shifted, though, is that journalists have now reached that. So sorry to say this, but journalists have now reached that bottom. That's people like Bob McCroskey, who were journalists, and so sorry about that, Bob. But and then after that is politicians. And so straight off the bat, you're walking into a role that has the least amount of trust and confidence with people. And why is that? Because all your decisions are now in the public square. It's not like you and I in the normal parts of life. You could go and do things, you could say things, and it's only our sphere of influence. Once you're in that public square, you're now making promises, you're promoting, you're purposing things into that place. And so therefore you're held to an account for that as well. So, yeah, so it's for me, I never had aspired to do that. And I'll be honest with you that I'd never been involved in any political party and so forth, but I knew that God had prepared us for that. So I can remember that one time Sam Lotoinga, he was the MP for Maunga Keke, said to me, look, you'll be great. Go to this party. And I said, no, I don't want to go there. Anyway, he hassled me for 2 years. I was a bit like Jonah looking for a whale, but none came past. And so my wife, Mocha, said to me, look, just go to the meeting. So I go to the meeting, and anyway, they said to me, so why do you want to become an MP? And I said, well, actually, I don't. So why are you here? Because my wife told me to come, right? So, and it's a true story. So I go there, and they said, okay, tell us about yourself. Construction and background. I did a theological degree, pastored in a church for 20 years, or in ministry for 20 years. And never studied politics, never been in any political party. And that's when someone said, well, then you're the perfect candidate. And I said, well, how do you figure that out? Why? Because it's called the House of Representatives. And I suppose at that moment, I felt that God had called both my wife and I, Mocha, into that place of politics as a way of being a representative, not only for the community and the country, but also for our faith and for our Christian beliefs.
it would be normal to expect actually someone like yourself to end up in the Labour Party. That's normally where you see Pacific Island Christians. How did you end up in the National Party?
Well, it's a bit like Christianity. A lot of times people make assumptions without knowing the truth, and the thing is that you're right, because normally I think like, okay, because the Labour Party often talk about social values, community, and those are very important, elements of the, cultural construct of being Polynesian. But the other part that they don't talk about, which National does talk about, is about aspiration, right? Self-determination. In other words, determining our future, what that looks like. In actual fact, that we weren't even back home, our dependency is in community, but our interdependence is the ability to innovate, to be entrepreneurs. Back home in the islands, we run our own businesses, we govern the country, right? And so this is what was actually being put forward to me as those values. And what I could see was that actually those are the values that we need most to succeed and to grow as Pacifica people. And the last thing was that the truth is the Labour Party never came and asked me, where the National Party did. And I believe it's because I wasn't a needy person, right? I mean, I was independent, mobile, articulate. I could do what I believed that I needed to do. I didn't need people to help me to succeed. And in fact, being independent made me, I suppose, was more attractive to the National Party coming and asking me to bring my values into the party.
It's interesting that Labour would want to say that they are the party of Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. And yet all these years later, many modern-day evangelical Christians would perceive that someone like yourself, conservative and Christian, is a real Christian. But a Labour politician who's also a Christian is probably not a real Christian. Talk to me about this kind of perception that somehow, in some circles of the church, the faith must always express itself in a certain direction politically.
Well, see, that's been part of the problem, Aaron, is that we buy into the narrative. You're either left or right, you're either blue or red, you're either white or black. And all it does is divide us and confuse us, rather than actually saying, what are the values that we have that are important and how do we express them? And actually, what people are looking for are people who express good values, strong principles, right? And a maturity that gives them confidence. But instead, it's unfortunate that the political climate is set up so we're sort of so adversarial that we're about saying we're better than the other. I mean, one of the things is that when I was in Parliament for those 9 years, I got on with most people across the House. In fact, some of my own colleagues would turn around and say, "Oh, how do you, I saw you having coffee or having lunch, with someone from the Labour." And I said, "Well, we play for the parliamentary rugby team. We get on with each other, we talk. We may not agree on certain things, so our ideologies may be different, but what we do have in common, then we should walk collectively together." And to me, this is where I believe that there's a challenge even now to politics currently in our nation, because it's all become about, personality politics rather than about principles. We've lost that sense of actually what's important. And often we try to make promises that we can't keep. But here's the flip side, Aaron, is that when you do make a mistake and you say sorry, on one hand, the nation says we want transparency, we want integrity. But then when you're upfront and honest about it, they see it as weakness. And I can remember one time when I was a cabinet minister, I had to apologise for something that I said. Do you know what happened, Aaron, to one of the journalists? They turned around and said to me, "Can you stop apologising?" I said, "Well, I only said it twice." And they said, "Yeah, but that's twice too many." And so there's this interesting sort of dichotomy of things, of ideologies that are clashing. On one hand, they want this, but then when you give it to them, they don't want that. So what do they want?
Talk to me about wearing your faith on your sleeve in the life of politics. For you, of course, it was unavoidable. A former pastor couldn't shake the fact that you were known as a Christian. But there are others in your party and in the Labour Party, and probably the other ones to boot, who are Christians but who really kind of keep that on the down low. We might call them undercover brothers. Tell me about the difference between being sort of out loud and proud about your faith and keeping it on the down low.
Well, in my first 6 years of politics, I have to say that, for me, I I exercised those Christian values. Like I wasn't preaching to people, but I'd go to the prayer meetings. They'd have a thing called a prayer breakfast. I'd stand up against things like when they call it the same-sex marriage bill that came through, and I remember I was challenged on that actually by Duncan Ngaro one time. I was heading into the caucus room, and he said, "Alfred, how are you going to vote on the gay marriage bill?" And I said, "Well, it's not gay marriage; it's called marriage redefinition." And then he said, "No, it's not." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "How are you going to vote anyway?" I said, "Well, I'm going to vote against it." He said, "Well, there you go, you're homophobic." And I said, "Well, no." I said, if you look at it, it's redefining marriage as we've known it, right? That comes from a Judeo-Christian base, comes from the Bible. So while we've got civil union, why would people who have a value that's not biblical want to change a definition that comes from a biblical base? And so I suppose that was the first time, in 2012, where I was stepping out and speaking my values into that. The interesting thing, Aaron, I never spoke against people, but because I made a stand, people felt that I was a threat to their own values. And so I believe that you can stand without being a threat. But the truth is, when you stand for your own truth, people perceive it their way, and then they speak out against you and even say that, well, look, you're trying to push your values and your views onto us when I wasn't. As time went on, I exercised that by, I would say to people, I'm here to serve. And I'd use those words intentionally. So wherever the party or people that were in there, ministers, I would travel, I would serve them. And I used the values that were there in a very real way. And I believe that brought favour for me, and I became a cabinet minister at the end of 2016. But it wasn't until the end of 2017 we came out of politics and out of parliament and government, and that I said prayed to the Lord and said, should I stay or should I go? And when the name of Jesus was taken out of the parliamentary prayer, it's like the Holy Spirit was really clear. I've chosen you for such a time to be a watchman on the wall, Ezekiel 33:7, and to uphold the name of Jesus as a banner for the nation. So every morning when Parliament sat, I would pray from 5:30 in the morning to 7 o'clock, inside and outside of Parliament. Why? Because I wanted to be the best watchman. I wanted to pray and intercede. So what am I saying, Aaron? Our faith has to be more than just an accessory, right? It can't be something we put on and take off. It has to be something that totally embodies who we are. It doesn't have to be something that actually is forceful onto other people, but just by our presence, just as Christ teaches us, that by being present and having, the values that people see, you're not just a good person. Actually, you're a person that actually has great values, that love, care, and forgive people, but also too speaks out against injustice and unrighteousness, things that you see that are wrong, that you can speak out against them. And I've done that in my 9 years that was there. I called out bad behavior. I said that wasn't good enough. And people didn't like that, and there was definitely some bad behavior, which I believe that was not good. And I went straight to them. Other people used it as gossip to say, oh, did you know about so-and-so? I didn't. I went straight to that person and said, hey, I've been told that this is what's happening about you. And if it's true, then you need to set it right and put it back into order. If it's not, then it's up to you to choose to do that. So that's how I lived my faith in politics and in Parliament.
It was the last election, it became clear that you were really being sidelined. You kind of could see the writing on the wall that unless you won your local electorate, you weren't getting back in. Was that a case, do you think, I know these things are complicated, of being in a sense too Christian for the party now, or were the issues far more complex than that?
Oh, they're always complex, but I do think that in some cases, because I spoke out strongly against the euthanasia bill, the abortion law reforms, and again, I never forcefully put my views onto other people. I just advocated in a robust way, which is what Parliament's all about. I believe for some people that, I became a threat. It's interesting because then someone said to me, oh, your conservatism has become a bit of a threat. And I said, well, give me an example. In what way? Did I stand over someone and did the old, and I was an evangelist back in the day, reading Ray Comfort's, all my friends are dying. And I went to the Billy Graham Attended Evangelist Conference. So in my heart is always about sharing the gospel of good news. But I'd said to people, had I ever done that to anyone in such a way to forcefully tell people, I could share my faith, and I have. And they said, well, no. Have you ever stood up in caucus and turned around and criticised people for their values that were different to mine? They said no. So what is it that I've become a threat? And people couldn't name it. But here's what I want to say, Aaron, which is a concern that we need to be aware of, is that conservatism has been sort of connected to being old, traditional, and irrelevant. Liberalism is now being seen as progressive and as the way of the future, right, for the nation and for our communities. So if you're conservative as a Christian, then you're like, a boomer, you're a dying breed. And now they've actually shifted that away from what I believe is really important. So, I believe we need to speak into that. We need to push back at that and actually say that the values that have been tried and true, love, trust, integrity, and acceptance, all of those things, actually, they're always going to be values that are going to be important for us as a nation.
The Bible says to be wise as serpents, but gentle as doves. Kind of sounds like a difficult thing to be. If you had to do your time over again, or perhaps talking to a politician who has a faith, but who's wondering, gee, how much do I let others know and see that faith? And how do I let it inform my experience as a politician? What advice would you give to a newbie?
Yeah, look, the advice I'd give is that, everything that we do in our Christian faith has to be based on a conviction, and a conviction means that God speaks to us through his word and then empowers us through his Holy Spirit. And so we always have to turn to the word. So for both my wife, Maka, and I, our calling was from Isaiah 58. And I love that because it says, make your voice like a trumpet, challenge the nation, my people, that this is the kind of fasting I've called you to do. And then verse 6, it talks about, so here's the fasting, to release the chains of injustice, to lift the yoke of oppression, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give shelter to the homeless, look after your own flesh and blood. Rebuild the city walls, restore the streets with dwellings. So that's God's kingdom development plan. That's always been who we are. So you've got to have a strong conviction. And then you've got to find your sense of purpose and what God is calling to you. Because people are looking, if you don't have a purpose or that has your sense of identity, then people don't know who you are. And so I know that my purpose that I've been given is to not only bring inspiration and innovation to ideas, to solutions, to problems that we face, but also to create a sense of acceptance and belonging. So creating community. So here's the funny thing, Aaron. In Parliament, I pretty much knew all the security guards, the cleaners, the caretakers, and my mates, my colleagues used to say to me, how do you know all these people? And I said, it only takes 2 minutes to say hello and ask a person how they're doing and how's their day, and to get to know their name. So we need to know what community and create community. And in the end, I became like the de facto pastor of Parliament, right? I'd have security and other people come up and pray for their marriages when they were sick and for their children, and in the end, many of them came along and basically, when I was leaving Parliament, gave me a hug, shook my hand and said, we're really going to miss you. And I suppose in a sense, when you go into politics, don't forget your witness is the way that you present yourself to other people as well. And you can have such a compassion and caring, but the authority that Jesus brought when he ministered was the ability to be present in such a way that you confronted the truth when it was there and not be afraid of that. We need to have a backbone and a spine that's not afraid to stand up for the things that we believe in. And when we do that, I believe that, politicians with a faith, if you can hold on to conviction, be known what your purpose is, and then bring them together, that presence, wherever you are in politics and in Parliament, will truly make a difference.
What a fabulous conversation today with Alfred Nado. He makes so many excellent points that it's very hard to pick out in particular one thing, except to say that what a difference clarity and conviction make, right? It meant that Alfred didn't have to second guess himself in the political arena. And I fear for Christopher Luxon and other Christians in Parliament that without clarity, what you get is this kind of second guessing. What is going to be popular? What is going to be palatable? What will others think of me if I actually confess to believing a certain thing about the way human beings are made and the way in which they flourish? We all have ideas about that. And of course, we need to remind ourselves that no faith is, of course, a religious position. Atheism, agnosticism, they're all ways of viewing the world. And we bring those into every part of our life. And so, of course, we shouldn't expect our politicians to be able to put those things down. I think increasingly what we just need is transparency. We just want to know, what do people really think, what do they really believe, and see if we can find some common ground. Certainly earlier in the episode, when I was comparing the things that Christopher Luxon said about his faith with the things that David Clark said, I couldn't help but think, why can't they just get along in Parliament? They seem to think so very similarly on so many things. You'd actually think that rather than Christianity and faith being something that's divisive, it should be unifying. It should be, in fact, the thing that brings the parties together, so that we don't have this stupid bipartisan approach to every topic, where if one party says that that's white, the other one says, well, it must be black then, as if it's their job to be a contrarian. Maybe faith, actually, rather than being a problem, might be one of the solutions, might be the thing that can draw us together around the table. Certainly I see that Christopher Luxon has found, I think, a helpful way of talking about faith. I see that on one of the interviews on the day that he was appointed, he remarked that, when asked about his faith, that he saw things differently, and it was good to have different points of view. I think that's a good starting point. We all have our point of view. Let's learn to be honest about that, and let's make sure that we don't impose our view on them. The challenge, of course, for Christians in all parts of life right now is that, what do you mean when you say so-and-so is a Christian? Because, of course, that's a whole big range of ideas and behaviours, and you might not agree to all of them. You might not ascribe to all of them. So we're going to have to do less assuming and more listening, something that we're not particularly good at in our culture. But good on Christopher Luxon for putting himself out there, at least to be honest, that he is a person of faith. And of course, he's got, in a sense, the most hated job in politics, leader of the opposition, but he could be the next Prime Minister. And how would New Zealand cope with having a strong evangelical Christian in the beehive? We will find out, potentially. Love to hear your thoughts about this. You can visit the website, activeintelligence.nz, and make sure you hit subscribe. We'll send you every episode, and we'll catch you next time on Active Intelligence.